From 1854 to 1867, Guangdong, China, experienced an unprecedented and incredibly brutal civil conflict. This struggle lasted 13 years, leaving millions dead and injured, with women, children, and the elderly becoming the greatest victims of this massacre. The violence reached such extreme levels that it can be compared to the Rwandan Genocide. This conflict reshaped the current distribution of Guangdong's three major ethnic groups, as well as the history of Chinese immigration in Southeast Asia and North America. However, this event is rarely discussed in Chinese history. It is known as the Hakka-Cantonese Conflict, a 土客械斗. Today, we will travel back in time to uncover the mystery of this forgotten, a century-old hatred of the East. In Guangdong, there are three major ethnic groups, and the Hakka-Cantonese conflict primarily refers to the clash between the Cantonese, Guangfu-ren, and the Hakka, Ke-Jia-ren. The ancestors of the Cantonese people mostly migrated south from central China during the Qin dynasty and the Tang and Song dynasties. After centuries of settlement, they deeply rooted themselves in the Pearl River Delta, gradually forming a native force bound by the Cantonese dialect, 粵語。
先推翻清政府者為大總統，袁世凱上面履行約定，唔算我方成。
The Hakka, on the other hand, were latecomers to the region. Due to the wars during the Song and Yuan dynasties, they were forced to leave their homes in Jiangxi, Fujian, and other provinces and settle in Guangdong. However, when they arrived, the fertile plains were already occupied by the Cantonese, so they had no choice but to settle in the barren hills. Despite having established settlements, the Hakka were still regarded as outsiders and were not accepted by the original residents. The Hakka were forced to work land that was only one-third the size of the Cantonese holdings. As the population of Hakka people in Guangdong grew, competition for farmland and water sources began between them and the Cantonese. Due to language barriers and cultural differences, tensions began to escalate. In 1851, Hong Xiuquan led a rebellion in Jintian village, Guangxi, which became known as the Taiping Rebellion, Taiping Tianguo, and its army was also called the Red Turban Army, Hongjinjun. Guangdong, being adjacent to Guangxi, was immediately affected. As the Taiping army expanded, social order in Guangdong collapsed. After the Red Turban Army entered Guangdong, they began recruiting locals to join their armed struggle. At the time, both Cantonese and Hakka farmers were eager to join the rebellion, but the Cantonese predominated, with relatively few Hakka involved. In July 1854, the Red Turban Army captured the city of Heshan, Heshan. During this battle, the young son of a Hakka landlord named Gao San was killed by the Red Turban Army. This infuriated the Hakka landlords, who vowed revenge, and this became one of the triggers for the conflict. The Qing government, struggling to suppress the Taiping forces, could not deploy enough troops. The magistrate of Heshan then devised a cunning plan to divide the rebels by exploiting the conflict between the Cantonese and the Hakka. He allied with the Hakka to form an armed militia, which was semi-professional. In 1855, this militia successfully wiped out the Red Turban Army. Seeing the Hakka's military strength, the local government began using Hakka militias to combat the Red Turban forces. However, after their victory, the Hakka militia became uncontrollable. Their long-standing conflicts with the Cantonese over land and water led them to launch systematic raids on Cantonese villages under the pretext of anti-bandit operations. They would round up men, decapitate them in front of ancestral halls, and take women as captives for forced labor. Survivors recall how the Hakka militias burned down homes, intentionally throwing the Cantonese family registers and land deeds into the flames to erase any proof of their land ownership. This brutal act triggered strong resentment and resistance from the Cantonese, which quickly escalated the conflict into an ethnic war. In the early stages of the conflict, the Qing government of China, preoccupied with suppressing the Taiping Rebellion and dealing with the Second Opium War, was unable to allocate military forces to suppress the local strife and could only adopt a hands-off approach to the regional conflict. Local officials attempted to mediate, but the deep-rooted animosity between the two sides had already escalated, and the conflict had reached a boiling point, causing any attempts at peace negotiations to be overturned. In March 1855, the Cantonese people, Guangfuren, began their brutal retaliation. They organized militias composed of local villagers, armed with Western guns and cannons purchased from Macau, and launched a surprise night raid on the Hakka settlement of Songbaishan in Enping. The massacre lasted for 3 days, during which Hakka villages were completely leveled, and wells became clogged with corpses. When survivors tried to escape into the deep mountains, they were ambushed by Cantonese forces, leaving only about 50 survivors. After the massacre, the Cantonese cut off the ears of the dead Hakka and strung them together as trophies, hanging them on banyan trees at the village entrance to serve as a grim warning. By May, the hatred escalated into an act of genocide. A Hakka leader named Ajia led 500 warriors to attack the Cantonese town of Shahuzhen, setting the entire town ablaze with kerosene. More than 200 captured Cantonese were tied to the pillars of the ancestral hall and burned alive. In the flames, the human figures twisted like ghosts, and the stench of charred flesh lingered for half a month. As tensions between the Hakka and Cantonese continued to intensify, what initially began as sporadic village skirmishes ultimately transformed into a full-scale war that engulfed all of Guangdong. This war was no longer confined to primitive hand-to-hand combat with sticks and knives, but had escalated into battles dominated by firearms and artillery. The Cantonese, relying on their prosperous trade network in the Pearl River Delta, purchased firearms and cannons from Hong Kong and Macau through the 13 Hongs, Shisanhang, a major trading guild. Historical records indicate that local gentry and landlords in Xinhui acquired 200 British Enfield rifles at a price of 80 taels of silver each and even hired retired British and French artillerymen to train the villagers. These rifles had long ranges and high accuracy, giving the Cantonese a decisive advantage on the battlefield. When the cannons fired within enclosed spaces, the shockwaves from the explosions tore human bodies apart. After the smoke cleared, the once sturdy fortress, which had sheltered over 800 people, was reduced to rubble, with only about 50 survivors crawling out from the ruins. Survivors later recalled that the cries of the wounded, trapped under the debris, lasted for 3 entire days before gradually fading away. Meanwhile, due to their economic disadvantage, the Hakka resorted to crafting homemade weapons. They filled bamboo tubes with gunpowder to make rockets, coating the arrowheads with arsenic, which caused severe infections and death when wounds festered. More lethal still, the Hakka used thick iron chains to blockade the Tan River, Tanjiang, strategically placing crossfire positions to accurately strike any Cantonese ships attempting to pass. In one instance, a cargo ship loaded with rice tried to break through the blockade, only to be struck simultaneously by 3 cannonballs. The violent explosion tore the ship apart, and more than 30 crew members were swallowed by the raging river without a chance to call for help. For several months afterward, corpses and remnants of cargo drifted on the Tan River, serving as a chilling testament to this bloody chapter in history. In 1859, a Cantonese coalition force of over 20,000 surrounded the Hakka's last stronghold, Yunxiang. This became one of the most brutal battles in the ongoing tug-of-war between the Cantonese and the Hakka. By this time, the Hakka had retreated into the mountains of the Chixi Peninsula, Shixibandao, where they fortified their defenses using the rugged terrain to their advantage. The Cantonese, however, had purchased British-made artillery from Hong Kong and launched an assault. In a single day, they managed to destroy 7 Hakka walled villages, Tulou, which were large, fortified homes typically used by the Hakka. These cannonballs exploded on impact, causing massive destruction and wide-ranging casualties. The bombardment caused the Hakka earth towers and walled villages to collapse on a large scale, destroying food supplies and contaminating water sources. By the 7th day of the siege, the Hakka had run out of ammunition and food, Faced with the encirclement of the Cantonese forces, the clan leader ordered the women and children to jump off cliffs, choosing death over the horrors of capture and further torture. Witnesses reported that the bodies piled up at the foot of the cliff were 3 meters high, and the river downstream of the Tanjiang River turned red with blood for half a month. The tributaries of Tanjiang beneath the cliff were said to be eerily tinged with a dark red hue. This battle resulted in the deaths of 20,000 Hakka, with only about 50 young men managing to break through the siege and escape to the deep mountains. By the end of this battle, the Hakka presence in the Pearl River Delta region had been nearly eradicated. The year is now 1862, and the ultimate battle that would determine the fate of the Cantonese and the Hakka is about to unfold. The Qing government had finally freed up resources to address the civil conflict in Guangdong. At that time, the governor of Huguang, Huguangzongdu, Ruilin, sent 5,000 troops from the Xiang army, Xiangjun, to the region. Officially, they were sent to quell the conflict, but in reality, they covertly sided with the Cantonese. The Qing government's favoritism was especially apparent in the distribution of resources. Ruilin ordered all 3,000 Western-made rifles from the Guangzhou arsenal, Guangzhou Junxieju, to be given to the Cantonese militias while enforcing a strict blockade on Hakka villages. At the time, transporting rice and salt required a good citizen certificate, Yangminzheng, issued by the Xiang army, but no such certificates were provided to the Hakka. As a result, by the following spring, famine broke out in Hakka villages, leading to horrific incidents of cannibalism. In Kaiping, the Xiang army allowed the Cantonese militias to commit a particularly vile act. They exhumed the ancestral graves of the Hakka. In just 1 month, over 700 Hakka ancestral tombs were dug up, and the remains were thrown into the Tanjiang River. When the Hakka went to the authorities to lodge a complaint, the Xiang army commanders said in open court, "You Hakka people gathering and causing trouble is rebellion. Digging up your ancestral graves is divine retribution." The Xiang army's brutal tactics did not stop there. In Taishan Guanghai, the Xiang army placed cannons where they could not be reached by the Hakka walled villages, Weiwu, specifically targeting the early morning hours to fire and wipe out the Hakka in one decisive strike. After the battle, as they cleared the battlefield, the Xiang army soldiers went from corpse to corpse, stabbing them with long spears, killing any who still showed signs of life. Perhaps the most chilling act of all was the construction of a Jingguan, Jingguan. The Cantonese stacked the bodies like firewood, creating a pyramid-shaped monument. The bottom layer consisted of adult male bodies, the middle layer of women, and the top layer of children. This macabre monument was 2 zhang, about 6.6 meters or 22 feet high, and on top of it flew a crimson flag with the words, "Exterminate the Hakka and secure the land." When the Xiang army commanders reported back to the Qing government, they deliberately slandered the Hakka, portraying them as barbaric troublemakers and falsely labeling their efforts at self-defense as rebellion. After this battle, the Hakka people's influence in the Pearl River Delta region was completely shattered. The Qing government, through policies of forced isolation and resettlement, temporarily quelled the conflict, but it resulted in the large-scale exile of the Hakka people. Hakka communities in western Guangdong and other areas were forced to leave their homeland. The survivors, carrying the elderly and children, fled along the rugged mountain paths toward Hainan and Guangxi. Many of them eventually became Akuli laborers and were sold to plantations in Southeast Asia, while some were sold to South America. The Hakka villages that remained in their original locations were set ablaze by the Cantonese, ensuring that no future threat would arise. This large-scale civil conflict in Guangdong not only changed the demographic structure of the Pearl River Delta but also left the darkest chapter in Guangdong's history.